The train had been the last of its kind, a work engine trailing 3 flat cars, stripped of everything but the smell of creosote and the memory of labor, and when it shuddered to a stop at the edge of a town with no name posted anywhere he could read, he understood that he had reached the end of something without arriving at the beginning of anything else. He climbed down with the canvas roll over his shoulder, the weight of it familiar in a way that nothing else around him was, the planes and chisels wrapped in oilcloth, each blade set against its neighbor the way his father had taught him, edge to spine, so that nothing would dull against nothing. In his coat pocket, folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, was the letter the foreman had written before the company disbanded, praising his joinery on trestles that would outlast the men who built them. He had not yet found a soul willing to unfold it. The town called itself Alkali Flat, though no sign said so. He learned the name only because a boy shouted it after him, not unkindly, simply as fact, the way one might name the weather. The heat pressed down through the early afternoon, like a hand on the back of the neck, and dust rose from the boardwalk with every step he took toward the Mercantile, where a man in a clean apron looked at him the way one looks at a stray dog that has wandered too close to a porch. "We don't sell to your kind," the man said, and turned back to his ledger before Wen could set down the roll to show him the letter. At the lumber yard, the answer came faster, delivered by a broad man with sawdust in his mustache, who did not even pretend to consider it. "Town feeling," he said, as though the words explained everything they were meant to explain, and perhaps in that town they did. The boarding house was worst, because it pretended to consider him. A woman came to the door, already wiping her hands on her apron, and by the time she reached him, a sign had appeared in the window behind her, freshly lettered, the ink still dark and wet at the edges of each stroke. No vacancy. She did not apologize. She simply held the door as though guarding it from something that might get in. By the time the sun leaned low enough to throw his shadow twice his height across the packed dirt of the street, Wen Li had knocked on every door that had a door, and every door had closed the same way, not with anger, which he might have answered, but with a flat, practiced indifference that left no seam for argument to enter. He stood at last at the edge of town, where the buildings gave out into scrub and rock, the letter still folded, the tools still wrapped, and looked toward the pale hills where the light was already beginning to change, wondering where in this wide, indifferent country a man was permitted to be useful. The lumber yard sat at the town's western edge, a long shed of raw pine planks stacked under a tin roof that ticked and groaned as it cooled from the day's heat, and the smell of sawdust hung so thick in the air that for a moment he could almost believe himself back among the trestles, among men who had judged him only by the truth of a joint. He went there because he had nowhere else to go, and because a man who builds things is drawn toward the places where building happens the way a thirsty man is drawn toward the sound of water. The owner stood near the front, a heavy-set man with sawdust caught in the creases of his forearms, and he looked up when the bell over the door gave its thin, complaining ring. "We don't hire your kind here," the man said, before Wen Li had spoken a single word, before the letter had even left his coat pocket. "Don't matter what you can do with a plane. Folks in this town wouldn't buy lumber I sold to a Chinaman, and I got a business to think of." A few men near the stacked joists had turned to watch, the way men will turn toward any small drama that breaks the monotony of an afternoon, and Wen Li felt their eyes settle on him with the particular weight of an audience that expects to be entertained by his humiliation. He did not argue. He had learned, in the weeks since the railroad camp disbanded and scattered its men like seed thrown against dry ground, that argument only lengthened the humiliation without altering its outcome. He nodded once, said nothing, and began to gather the canvas roll he had set down at his feet, coiling the leather ties around the planes and chisels with the same unhurried care he gave to every tool he owned, as though the world's refusal were no reason to treat good steel carelessly. It was this, the coiling, not the refusal, that a woman standing near the wagon yard noticed. She had come to price fence rails and had stopped, as people do, to watch another person's misfortune unfold, but her eyes had gone not to the lumberman's face, nor to the onlooker's smirks, but to the stranger's hands, the way his thumb ran along the flat of a chisel to check it was clean before he wrapped it, the way he laid each plane in its place within the roll, as though the roll itself remembered the shape of every tool it had carried for years. There was no shame in those hands, only order, only a patience that seemed to belong to some quieter, more exacting world than the one currently denying him a livelihood. She said nothing yet, but she did not look away, and when he straightened with the canvas roll under his arm and turned to leave, her gaze followed him past the stacked lumber and out into the white glare of the street, already turning some private calculation over in her mind. She waited until he had crossed the width of the wagon yard and stepped into the shade thrown by the depot's overhang before she followed, her boots quiet on the packed dirt, her bonnet pushed back so that the sun fell full on her face, and she did not have to squint to see him clearly. She was not a woman given to hurry, and she did not hurry now, but there was a directness in the way she closed the distance between them that made him stop and turn, as though he had felt the weight of her attention before he heard her step. "You do fine work," she said, without preamble, nodding toward the canvas roll beneath his arm. "I could see it from across the yard. A man doesn't care for his tools that way, unless he knows what they're worth to him." He did not answer at once. He had learned, in the weeks since the railroad let his crew go, that kindness offered on a public street was often a prelude to some further humiliation, and he waited to see what shape hers would take. "My barn roof came down under the March snow," she said when he offered nothing. "Grain's sitting exposed under canvas and old fence boards, and it'll rot before the county comes for its taxes, which is 4 weeks from Saturday. I need it rebuilt, and rebuilt right, and I haven't the hands to do it myself." She paused, studying him the way she might study a plow horse before buying it, not unkindly, but plainly, weighing what she saw against what she needed. "I can offer $1 a day, your board, and your meals, and I'll put it in writing so there's no confusion on either side about what's owed." "You have not asked what I charge for such work in the East," he said, "or whether I am capable of it." "I watched you fold that roll," she said. "I don't need to ask." There was a silence between them then that was not uncomfortable, only careful, the silence of two people each deciding how much trust the moment could bear. He thought of the letter of reference folded soft as cloth in his coat, of the lumberman's face turned away from it, as though the paper itself gave off an odor, and he understood that this woman had not asked to read it because she had already read something else, his hands, his order, the plain fact of the roll under his arm, and found it sufficient. "I would want the agreement signed before I begin," he said at last, "so that neither of us mistakes the other's meaning later." "That's fair," she said, and something in her face eased, not quite a smile but its foundation. "I've a wagon at the feed store. You can ride out with me now, if you're willing, and see the barn before you decide anything further." He looked once more down the street where the boarding house sign still hung in its fresh paint, then hefted the canvas roll higher against his shoulder. He was willing, and he said so with a small nod that felt, to him, like the first honest transaction he had made in the territory, and together they walked to the feed store where a sway-backed mare stood hitched to a wagon bed, still smelling of last season's oats. The road out of town ran pale and rutted between stands of ocotillo, and he sat with the canvas roll across his knees the whole way, watching the land open into scrub and distance, thinking that a man could disappear out here as easily as he could be found. The homestead announced itself first by smell, wet grain souring under canvas tarps weighted with stones, and then by sight, the barn's roofline sagging inward like a jaw broken and left unset, rafters splintered white where the snow had finally won its argument with old wood. A boy stood in the yard with a hatchet loose in his hand, not working, only holding it the way a person holds a thing they mean to use if called upon, and he watched the wagon come in with an expression that made no attempt to hide its suspicion. "This is Tobias," she said, climbing down. "My brother." "He's the carpenter," she told the boy, before the boy could ask, and the boy looked at Wen's hands rather than his face, the same way she had, though there was none of her steadiness in it, only a boy's raw wariness dressed up as manhood. "Pa built that barn," the boy said, to no one in particular, and Wen understood the sentence was not information, but a kind of warning. "Then I will try to build it as well as he did," Wen said, and set down the canvas roll on a dry patch of ground, and began, without further ceremony, to walk the collapsed frame the way he had once walked a trestle before deciding whether it would bear the weight of iron and men. The damage was thorough but not total. That was the first mercy of the day. He found sound sills beneath the fallen roof, oak gone gray but unrotted, and a run of ridge beam that had cracked along a knot rather than along the grain, which meant it could be spliced rather than replaced. He worked through the wreckage board by board, setting aside what could be saved into one pile and what could not into another, the ruined wood going onto a heap that would later serve as kindling, the good wood laid flat and weighted against warping. Tobias watched from the fence rail for a long while without speaking, hatchet still in hand, until finally he said, "You're slow," in a voice pitched to wound. "I am careful," Wen answered, not looking up from the beam he was testing with his thumb along its seam. "There is a difference, though I understand it does not always look like one from where you are standing." The boy said nothing more, but he did not leave the fence rail either, and Wen, sorting timber in the thinning afternoon light, decided that was answer enough for a first day. Cal Preston came at mid-morning with the smell of the corral still on him and a coil of rope over his shoulder that he did not need for anything, only that it gave his hands something to do while he talked. He found her at the wash line, arms lifted to pin a sheet, and he stood a moment before he said what he had ridden over to say, as men often do when they have practiced a speech and cannot find the door of it once they arrive. "Heard you took on the Chinaman for the barn," he said. "I did," she answered, not turning, a clothespin still between her teeth. "Folks in town ain't going to like it. Higgins already don't." "Higgins doesn't have to like it. He isn't roofing my barn." Cal shifted his weight, rope creaking against his shoulder. "I'm only saying what's said. A man like that working your land, sleeping in your tack room." She turned then, and there was nothing sharp in her face, only a tiredness that had settled there since the snow took the roof, and beneath the tiredness something immovable, like a fence post set deep enough that a man could lean his whole weight against it and feel only his own foolishness for trying. "I have a written agreement," she said, $1 a day, board, and 4 weeks to raise a barn before the county comes for its taxes. He's the only man in this territory who looked at my problem and told me the truth of what it would cost to fix, instead of telling me what he thought I wanted to hear. That's worth more to me than what folks are saying on the boardwalk. Cal opened his mouth, found nothing further to put in it, and closed it again. She went back to the wash line. "You're welcome to help him with the framing if your objections don't run so deep you can't lift a beam," she said, not unkindly, and that was the whole of the matter as far as she intended to make it. Wen, 40 yards off at the barn site, heard none of the words but understood the shape of the conversation from the set of the man's shoulders and the way Sarah's chin had lifted a fraction before she turned away. He had learned to read arguments in postures long before he had learned to read them in a language not his own. He did not pause his work to watch. He measured the ridge beam again, marked it with a pencil kept behind his ear, and began the long, patient work of scarfing the splice, the sun climbing hard and white overhead until sweat darkened the collar of his shirt and stung at the corners of his eyes. He did not complain of the heat, because complaint was a coin he had learned young not to spend, and because the beam did not care whether the hands shaping it were welcome, only whether they were true. By the 4th day, the skeleton of the barn had begun to rise out of the churned mud, like the ribs of some great patient animal, and she found herself pausing at odd hours, hanging wash, carrying water to the chickens, walking back from the garden with her apron full of squash, to stand a moment at the fence and watch the way he worked. There was nothing wasted in it. He measured twice and cut once, as her father had always said a good carpenter should, but where her father's hands had been slow and deliberate, his moved with a quickness that never once slipped into carelessness. Each mortise cut clean and square, each tenon fitted so tightly that he needed no more than a mallet's tap to seat it home. She had watched hired men waste whole boards to greenness or knots, had watched them curse and start again, but he seemed to see the grain before the saw ever touched it, and the pile of offcuts at his feet grew only slowly, and always into kindling, never into ruin. She said nothing of this to him directly, for she was not a woman given to praise spoken plainly, but she began leaving a second cup of coffee at the corner post each morning without being asked, and she noticed that he always drank it before it went cold, as though he understood the gesture for what it was. In the evenings, when the light had gone soft and orange over the western ridge, and the day's heat had begun at last to loosen its grip, he took a lamp out to the tack room and called Tobias in with a nod rather than words, and the boy, wary at first, came anyway, drawn by something in the quiet authority of the invitation. Wen set a chisel and a whetstone between them on an overturned crate and showed him, without a single wasted motion, how to hold the blade at the proper angle, how to feel for the burr along the edge with the pad of a thumb, how to draw the steel across the stone in long, even strokes until it sang rather than scraped. "Too much pressure," he said, the English coming careful and unhurried, when the boy pressed too hard and the stone screeched. "Let stone do the work. Chisel only needs to be guided." Tobias frowned, tried again, and this time the sound came smoother, and something in his young face eased into a kind of proud astonishment that he had not expected of himself. Wen said nothing more, only nodded once, and took up his own blade to true alongside him, and the lamplight held the two of them there in the tack room a long while, the rasp of steel on stone the only sound beneath the wide black dome of the desert sky, while Sarah, in the house, saw the glow through the window and did not call the boy in for bed. The morning came dry and bright, with the kind of heat that pressed down on the shoulders before the sun had even cleared the ridge, and by the time the barn's rafters were pegged and squared, he saw that the ridge beam would need 2 more lengths of clear pine, longer than anything already stacked beside the foundation. He said as much over breakfast, counting the measurements on his fingers in a manner that made the boy watch with fascination, and she nodded and pressed 2 folded bills into his palm, along with the list written in her own plain hand, and told him to take the wagon in, since the walk alone would eat half his morning, and she had fencing that could not wait. He drove in with the sun climbing behind him, tied the horse at the rail, and walked into the lumber yard with the paper held out before him, the way a man might hold out a passport at a border he did not trust. The owner looked at the paper first, and then at the hand that held it, and something in his face closed like a shutter drawn against weather. "Told you before," the man said. "Can't sell to you direct. Town feeling on it, and I got a business to run." "Mrs. Dunmore sent the order," Wen said, keeping his voice even, the way he had learned to keep it even, at every counter and gate that had turned him away since the railroad let him go. "Money is hers, lumber is for her barn. Then she can come herself," the man said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than if he had been cruel about it. "And I'll sell it to her. Can't be seen selling to you." Folks talk. There was no arguing a wall built of other men's opinions, and Wen had learned long ago that arguing only wasted breath better spent on work that could speak plainer than any words he might offer. He folded the paper back into his pocket, thanked the man with the same courtesy he had shown on entering, and walked the empty wagon back through the heat without a board in it. When he reached the homestead, she was at the fence line, hammer in hand, and she straightened at the sound of the wheels and read the emptiness of the wagon bed before he said a single word. He told her plainly what had passed, the measurements still exact in his mind: 2 12-foot lengths, clear pine, no knots near the bearing points, enough tar paper besides for the north slope before the next rain came through. And she listened with her jaw set and her eyes narrowed against the glare, turning the hammer once in her hand, as though weighing something heavier than iron. 12-foot clear, she repeated, as if fixing it to memory. "Anything else?" "That is all," he said, "for now." She looked toward the wagon, then toward the road that ran west out of Alkali Flat, and did not answer him at once. She set the hammer down on the fence post with the particular care of a woman setting aside one task to take up another, and told him to see to the stock, that she would be back before dark. He asked her nothing, though the question stood plain in his face, and she offered no more than that she knew the road to Cottonwood Junction and had driven it before, in another season, for reasons that belonged to a life she did not often speak of. By the time he had the horses fed and the boy set to mucking the near stall, she had the wagon hitched and a canvas tarp folded flat beneath the bench, and she climbed up onto the seat with the ease of someone who had done harder things alone than a 20-mile drive under an Arizona sun. He watched the wagon go small against the road, dust rising thin behind the wheels, and he did not let himself imagine what might go wrong on a road that far from any help, because there was work waiting that would not finish itself through worry. He set the boy to sorting nails by length into 3 coffee tins, a task the boy took to with more seriousness than it strictly required, and together they measured the north wall a second time, checking figures already checked, because a carpenter's hands wanted something to hold when his mind was elsewhere. The sun went down and came up changed color through the dust the way it did most evenings, and still she had not returned, and he found himself standing at the fence more than once, listening for wheels on hardpan. It was near dusk, the sky gone the color of a bruise healing, when he heard it at last, the particular creak of a loaded wagon, heavier now, laboring slightly on the last rise before the house, and he was already moving toward the road before the boy called out that she was back. She looked tired in the way that comes from holding reins tense for hours rather than from any single hard thing, but her face, when she saw him, had something bright folded into the tiredness, and she nodded toward the wagon bed without waiting to be asked. It was stacked with clear pine, cut true, tar paper rolled in oiled bundles at the front, and a coil of new rope besides that he had not requested but recognized instantly as useful. "Cottonwood Junction," she said, climbing down stiff-legged, sells lumber to anyone with cash in hand, and no questions asked about who's building with it. She looked at him then, steady, the way she had looked at his tools that first morning, rather than at his face. I told them what it was for. They didn't care. Wish I could say the same for folks closer to home. She untied the first bundle herself before he could reach it, and handed him the end of the rope like it was nothing at all, like it was simply the next thing that needed doing. The lumber went up fast after that, board by board rising into the skeleton of the barn like ribs closing over a chest, and for 2 days the weather held clear and hot and merciless, the kind of heat that made the pine smell sharp and resinous under the saw. He worked from the gray hour before dawn until the light gave out, and the hired hand worked beside him now without being asked, though the words between them stayed few and careful, the way men speak who have not yet decided what to call each other. It was on the third afternoon that the sky changed color all at once, going the strange green-yellow of a bruise, and the wind dropped to nothing so suddenly that the quiet itself felt like a warning. He had seen this before, once, on a trestle in the high country, and he did not wait for anyone to tell him what it meant. He was already moving toward the half-raised trusses when the first stones came down, small as gravel, and then larger, hammering the tin scraps and the raw wood with a sound like 100 fists. The hired hand was shouting something lost beneath the noise, already climbing, and between them they worked without any plan spoken aloud, only the plain animal understanding that the trusses would tear loose from their green joints if the wind got under them wrong. He threw rope to the hand, and the hand caught it without looking, and they lashed the crossbeams down together, hail striking their shoulders and the backs of their necks hard enough to bruise, ice gathering white in the seams of the framing, like snow that had forgotten its season. Neither of them spoke of danger. There was only the next knot and the next, and the particular economy of 2 men who had stopped weighing each other and started simply working, hands passing rope and nails between them, with the unthinking trust of long habit, though it had been earned in minutes rather than years. When the hail passed as suddenly as it came, leaving the yard glittering and strange under a clearing sky, they stood beneath the dripping frame, breathing hard, and the hired hand looked up at the trusses holding fast and then at him, and did not smile, exactly, but something in his face loosened that had been tight since the first morning. "Didn't figure you'd stay up there," the hand said, wiping ice water from his jaw. "Didn't figure you would either," he answered, and for the first time the silence between them afterward held nothing but the easy tiredness of men who had done a hard thing well, together, and knew it without needing to say so twice. The barn had 2 weeks left in it when the town's well came up dry in a different way than water. The previous digger had thrown up his hands months before, declaring the old timber housing rotted past saving and the shaft itself unstable where it met bedrock, and the town council had simply let it stand fenced off and useless, hauling water instead from a spring 2 miles out that froze half the winter and ran thin the other half. He had walked past that fenced well every week on the road into Alkali Flat, and one evening, standing at its rim with the last of the daylight going copper over the flats, he had seen what the other man had missed. Not a shaft beyond saving, but a housing built wrong from the start, unbraced against the shifting of the ground, the whole weight resting on rot instead of stone. He mentioned it to her only once, over supper, in the plain way he mentioned most things, and she had looked at him a long moment before saying that if he thought he could fix what the town had given up on, he ought to go and say so himself. It took him 3 visits to the council office before anyone would hear him out, and even then it was less persuasion than exhaustion on their part, the mayor waving a hand and saying he could try if he furnished his own timber and took no pay unless it held. It held. He built the new housing with a reinforced timber frame keyed into fresh-cut stone at the base, and a windlass that turned smooth and true where the old one had groaned like a dying animal, and when he drew the first bucket up clean and cold in front of a small gathered crowd, nobody cheered, exactly, but there was a stillness that spoke louder than cheering would have. After that, something in the town's weather changed the way weather does before anyone names it. A rancher's wife stopped Sarah outside the dry goods store to ask, in a voice pitched low as though it were a small shame, whether the carpenter might spare a day to look at her henhouse roof. A man who had refused him a room a month before nodded to him now on the boardwalk, not warmly, but without the old flat refusal in his eyes. Higgins himself, at the lumber yard, said nothing at all, but weighed out a length of pine for Tobias's slingshot handle without being asked twice, and did not mention town feeling once. Wen took none of it as victory. He only noted, quietly, that there was more work now than his hands could carry alone, and said as much to her one evening, watching the barn's near-finished frame black against the last light. The last trusses went up on a morning so still that the sound of the mallet carried clean across the yard, striking wood on wood in a rhythm that had become, over 4 weeks, as familiar as breathing. He worked from the ladder while she steadied the brace below, and between them passed the lumber and the pegs and the small, silent understanding of two people who no longer needed to explain what came next, in a task neither had spoken aloud. The barn's bones stood almost whole now, ribbed against the sky like something that had grown there rather than been built, and the smell of raw pine had settled into the yard so thoroughly that she said she thought she would smell it in her hair for a year after. They talked as they worked, but not of wages now, nor of timber, nor of the tax deadline that had once sat over every conversation like a held breath. He asked her, hauling a beam into place, what she meant to plant come spring, and she told him beans and a second field of grain if the rains held, and asked in turn whether he meant to stay in the territory once the barn was finished, or whether a man with his hands might find better wages in a city somewhere east, building things grander than a homesteader's barn. He considered this longer than the question seemed to warrant, fitting a peg with more care than it required. "There is no city that needs this barn," he said finally. "Only you need this barn." She did not answer that directly, only handed up the last of the trusses and watched him set it, and something in her face suggested she had heard the fuller sentence beneath the plain one. By afternoon they had reached the doors, and hanging them true was work that could not be hurried, each hinge set and reset until the great panels swung without catching, without complaint, closing over the grain sacks, stacked dry and safe inside, like something being tucked in for the night. Tobias stood in the doorway sighting along the seam the way Wen had taught him to sight along a blade, and pronounced it good, and Cal Preston, passing with a coil of rope over his shoulder, allowed that it was about the finest set of barn doors he'd seen in the territory, and did not say it as though the admission cost him anything at all anymore. Sarah stood back from it all, hands on her hips, looking at the whole standing structure the way a person looks at a debt finally paid, and then at him, and said only, "Come up to the house when you're done here. Supper's near ready." He washed at the trough behind the tack room, the way he had washed every evening for 4 weeks, working the grit of sawdust and hail-bruised weather out of hands that had stopped, sometime in the second week, feeling like hands that belonged to a stranger passing through. The water ran gray, then clear, and he dried them on the same cloth he had used since the first night, and thought, as he had not let himself think until the doors were hung and true, that the work was finished, and that finished work in this country had a way of ending a man's welcome as surely as it had earned it. The kitchen window threw its yellow square across the yard, and he crossed to it slowly, the way a man crosses toward something he has not yet decided he is permitted to want. Inside, the table was set as it had been set every night, plates and bread and a pot still ticking with heat, except that at the head of it, where no chair had stood in 4 weeks of suppers taken at the long side with the hired hands and the boy, there was now a chair pulled square and waiting, and it was waiting for him. She did not make a speech of it. She set down the last dish, straightened, and looked at him the way she had looked at his tools on the first day, plainly, without flinching, as though the truth of a thing was never improved by dressing it in more words than it needed. "When," she said, and it was the first time the name had passed between them, instead of the labor around it. "Sit here." He stood a moment in the doorway with the evening still on his shoulders, the smell of hay and cut pine and hot bread all mixed together into something that had, without his quite marking when, become the smell of a place rather than a job. "That chair is for the head of a house," he said, not as a question, though it carried one inside it. "It is," she said. "I'm asking you to take it, not for wages, not for the season, for as long as you'll have it, as a partner, if that suits you, and not as a man I hired to fix what was broken and then send off when it was mended." Tobias, already seated, was watching with the particular stillness of a boy, pretending not to listen to the thing he most wants to hear. Wen crossed the room, past the long side where he had eaten every meal since the snow took the roof, and pulled out the chair at the head of the table, and sat. "Then I'll stay," he said, and glad of it, and outside the window, the barn stood square and roofed against the dark, holding the grain safe, holding, too, everything else that had been rebuilt alongside it.